Daemon Targaryen should have been king. The second I say that, half of you probably want to click off this video. When most people think of Daemon, they don't picture a wise, measured ruler. They think of a reckless, volatile prince. They see a man who laughed at his sister-in-law's funeral, started a private war for personal glory, ignored royal decrees whenever they inconvenienced him, and solved every political dispute with Dark Sister in his hand and Caraxes screaming overhead. To many, Daemon isn't the man who should have ruled Westeros. He's the exact agent of chaos who should have been kept as far away from the Iron Throne as possible. I understand that perspective. This is a prince who could be effortlessly charming one moment and terrifyingly cruel the next. He inspired fanatical loyalty just as easily as he inspired deep, permanent hatred. He was a warrior who never backed down from a fight, even when basic common sense demanded de-escalation. He was impulsive, arrogant, violent, and utterly unpredictable. Those are not the traditional qualities of a good king, or are they? By the way, if you love deep dives into Targaryen history and character breakdowns like this, please subscribe to the channel. We are brand new, and your support helps us make more videos just like this one. Here is the uncomfortable reality of Westeros. The qualities that make someone a good person are rarely the same qualities that make them a successful ruler. History proves this repeatedly. Some of the kindest, most well-meaning kings nearly shattered the realm because they lacked the stomach for hard decisions. Meanwhile, some of the most ruthless monarchs kept the peace for decades simply because no one dared to cross them. Governing Westeros isn't about maintaining moral purity. It's about survival. It's about keeping ambitious, plotting lords in check, and knowing exactly when to show mercy, and when mercy is indistinguishable from weakness. This is why Daemon Targaryen deserves far more credit than he gets. I am not claiming Daemon was a saint. Far from it. He made horrific decisions throughout his life. Many were selfish, some were needlessly cruel, and others carried devastating historical consequences. This isn't a defense of his morality, nor is it an attempt to retroactively justify his worst impulses with secret, noble intentions. Instead, we have to examine something far more compelling. When you separate Daemon the husband, the brother, and the rogue from Daemon the administrator and military commander, a completely different figure emerges. The prince everyone feared was exactly the sovereign the Seven Kingdoms actually needed. Daemon did not become infamous overnight. Long before the Dance of the Dragons, long before his marriage to Rhaenyra, and long before civil war tore the realm apart, Daemon had already carved out a reputation unlike anyone else. He was impossible to ignore. Even as a youth, he possessed an intangible quality that his older brother, King Viserys, desperately lacked: absolute presence. When Daemon entered a room, the atmosphere shifted. When he spoke, the court listened. When he took to the battlefield, his enemies panicked. And when he mounted the bloodworm, Caraxes, everyone knew the stakes had changed. That kind of gravity cannot be taught, bought, or inherited. It certainly cannot be conjured merely by wearing a crown. Daemon simply had it. Critics often assume Daemon coveted the throne out of simple, naked ambition. While he certainly possessed Targaryen pride and enjoyed the status of his birthright, his drive stemmed from a deeper source: profound frustration. Imagine watching your brother sit upon the most powerful seat in the known world, knowing he is a decent man who wants peace, yet watching him make the same fatal compromises over and over again. Viserys delayed difficult choices, gave dangerous rivals endless chances, and ignored brewing conflicts until they became active disasters. Viserys wasn't weak because he lacked physical courage. He was weak because he hated conflict. But kings do not have the luxury of avoiding conflict. If you refuse to confront a problem early, it simply grows, and eventually, someone else has to bleed to fix it. More often than not, that someone was Daemon. There is a persistent myth that Daemon was purely an agent of chaos. While he certainly caused his share of disruption, he spent a significant portion of his life cleaning up structural messes that others had allowed to spiral out of control. There is no better proof of this than his tenure in King's Landing. Before Daemon took command of the City Watch, the capital was a haven for lawlessness. Crime was rampant. Murder, extortion, and theft ruled the streets. The dark alleys of Flea Bottom belonged to gangs and syndicates, while the average citizen lived in constant terror. The Crown's authority stopped at the Red Keep's gates. When Daemon was appointed commander of the Watch, he transformed the institution almost overnight. He took a disorganized, corrupt, and ineffective collection of guards and forged them into one of the most disciplined military forces in the realm. He standardized their equipment, instituted rigorous training, and clad them in the iconic gold cloaks that became a permanent symbol of royal authority. This transformation was not accidental. Daemon understood a core tenet of statecraft. Authority must be visible to be respected. Uniforms, discipline, and presence matter because criminals do not stop breaking the law out of respect for abstract statutes. They stop when they believe there is a swift, inevitable force ready to enforce those laws. His methods were brutal. He cleaned up the streets with public dismemberments, swift executions, and zero tolerance for excuses. The highborn lords of the small council were horrified by his lack of due process. But the results were undeniable. Crime plummeted, and for the first time in memory, the citizens knew the crown actually controlled the city. This is the paradox of Daemon Targaryen. His methods made comfortable people uneasy, but they worked. If a ruler is judged by the stability and results they deliver rather than the gentleness of their intent, then Daemon's record is formidable. The ultimate test of Daemon's leadership did not take place in the alleys of King's Landing, but across the narrow sea. The War for the Stepstones exposed the fundamental difference between Viserys' passive governance and Daemon's proactive realism. The Stepstones, a barren chain of rocky islands between Westeros and Essos, were of paramount strategic value. They controlled the primary shipping lanes for global trade. For years, the Triarchy, a powerful alliance of the free cities, used these islands to harbor pirates, harass Westerosi shipping, and extract heavy tributes. House Targaryen, whose vast wealth kept the realm afloat, was losing fortunes. This wasn't a minor border skirmish. It was a direct challenge to Targaryen supremacy, and the crown did nothing. Viserys preferred diplomacy. War is expensive, destructive, and unpredictable. But in the brutal geopolitical landscape of Westeros, refusing to respond to a direct provocation is rarely viewed as diplomatic maturity. It is viewed as weakness. When a king fails to defend his borders, he invites deeper incursions. Daemon recognized this immediately. He understood that if the Iron Throne did not project strength, its authority would erode. Alongside Lord Corlys Velaryon, he launched a campaign to reclaim the islands. He didn't wait for endless council meetings or royal permission. He took Caraxes and went to war. Critics point to this as evidence of his impulsiveness, but the Triarchy had already initiated the conflict by slaughtering Westerosi sailors. Ignoring the threat would not make it disappear. It merely guaranteed that the eventual war would be fought under much worse terms. Daemon valued action over the paralysis of endless debate. Viserys' court was defined by meetings, compromises, and delays. While they talked, their enemies acted. The Stepstones campaign was brutal and protracted. The crab feeder utilized guerrilla tactics, retreating into deep caves to nullify the advantage of Targaryen dragons. Daemon experienced years of hardship, hunger, and mutinous whispers. He was not a spoiled prince playing at war. He was a commander who suffered alongside his men, learning the harsh realities of asymmetric warfare. This culminated in his legendary gambit on the beaches of Bloodstone. Sensing that his forces were on the brink of collapse, Daemon surrendered his pride. He marched onto the beach alone, offering himself as bait to draw the crab feeder's forces out of their impenetrable caves. It was an incredibly high-risk maneuver, but it was grounded in a keen understanding of psychological warfare. The enemy's desire to claim the ultimate prize, the brother of the king, blinded them to the trap. When they rushed out to claim their victory, the Valyrian fleet in Caraxes struck, breaking the Triarchy's hold on the region. This victory illustrated Daemon's capacity for calculated risk. The greatest commanders in history are not those who avoid danger, but those who understand when the strategic payoff justifies the hazard. His soldiers followed him because he led from the front lines, bleeding in the mud with them rather than commanding from the safety of a castle. Viserys inspired affection. Daemon inspired confidence. In a crisis, soldiers and lords alike do not look for a gentle soul. They look for someone who can win. Beneath the violence, the ambition, and the calculated chaos, Daemon possessed a core value that guided his most significant decisions, an absolute devotion to his family name. There is a common narrative that Daemon was entirely self-serving. Yet if his only objective was usurping the throne, his political choices make very little sense. A calculating usurper stays close to the seat of power. They remain in King's Landing, whispering in the king's ear, buying the loyalty of guards, and quietly building a faction until the crown can be easily seized. Instead, Daemon repeatedly walked away. He left the capital when insulted, when exiled, or when his presence threatened his brother's peace. He did not play the subtle game of political manipulation. Unlike Otto Hightower, who masked his self-interest behind a polite, subservient smile, Daemon wore his ambitions and frustrations openly. He did not hide what he wanted. His primary loyalty was to the House of the Dragon. Daemon fought bitterly with Viserys, but the moment an outsider threatened his family's authority, his demeanor shifted entirely. He could not tolerate external threats to Targaryen supremacy. He understood that dragons alone did not keep the Seven Kingdoms united. The illusion of absolute, undivided strength did. The moment the High Lords of Westeros sensed vulnerability or division within the royal family, the stability of the entire system would collapse. Because Daemon spent his life dealing with ambitious nobles, he saw through their courtly manners. He recognized early on that Otto Hightower's seemingly loyal advice was designed to slowly position his own bloodline closer to the Iron Throne. Viserys viewed Otto as a trusted friend. Daemon saw him as a threat to the Targaryen dynasty. History vindicated Daemon's suspicion. The seeds of the Dance of the Dragons were not sown when Viserys died, but decades earlier in council chambers where Viserys allowed his hand to quietly build a rival power base. Daemon foresaw the coming storm, while Viserys continuously hoped the clouds would blow over. Hope is a comforting quality in a parent, but it is a disastrous policy for a monarch. This perspective clarifies Daemon's alignment with Rhaenyra. While their relationship was complex and controversial, his commitment during the succession crisis was absolute. He championed her claim because he believed that once the king had designated an heir, that decision had to be defended at all costs. To allow the lords of the realm to overturn the king's decree set a dangerous precedent. It meant the crown could be contested by whoever compiled the largest army. Daemon understood that a kingdom can survive an unpopular ruler, but it cannot easily survive a disputed succession. His actions were aimed at preserving the long-term authority of the dynasty. To analyze Daemon properly, we must address his deepest flaws. He was exceptionally violent. His initial instinct in almost any confrontation was to escalate, and he possessed a volatile temper that regularly alienated potential allies. By any modern standard of ethics, he was a dangerous man. But we must ask, was Daemon's violence unique, or was he simply more transparent about the coercion that underpins all royal authority? The Iron Throne was not forged through diplomatic consensus. Aegon the Conqueror did not unify Westeros with speeches. He did so with the fire of Balerion. The peaceful reign of Jaehaerys the Conciliator rested entirely on the undisputed knowledge that he possessed the ultimate military deterrent. Every Targaryen king governed through the implicit threat of violence. Daemon simply refused to wrap that reality in polite euphemisms. He understood that the crown was not merely a decorative symbol of honor, it was an instrument of force. Viserys carried the crown like a heavy burden. Daemon would have worn it like armor. Consider the crises that defined Viserys's reign. Almost none of them were caused by acting too quickly or decisively. They were caused by chronic hesitation, by hoping disputes would resolve themselves, and by refusing to offend anyone. Viserys spent his life trying to keep every faction happy, and in doing so, he ensured that the eventual explosion would be catastrophic. Daemon would have made enemies, but he would have made decisions. In the brutal landscape of Westeros, decisive action prevents small fractures from becoming deep chasms. Rebellious lords would have feared King Daemon. They would not have assumed they could manipulate him, nor would they have expected him to tolerate conspiracies within his court. He would have cut down his rivals long before they had the strength to launch a civil war. Would the Dance of the Dragons have occurred under King Daemon? It is highly unlikely. Not because Daemon would have magically cured the rivalries of the court, but because he would have recognized the threat years before it reached a point of no return. He would not have permitted rival factions to build military alliances under his nose, nor would he have mistaken quiet resentment for loyalty. He knew that rebellions grow slowly, nurtured by a ruler's indecision. When we evaluate whether Daemon Targaryen deserved the Iron Throne, we have to look past our desire for a morally upstanding protagonist. Westeros is not a moral world. It is a brutal, feudal society where peace is maintained through the balance of terror and the projection of absolute authority. Who was better equipped to govern that world? A king who hoped for the best and avoided conflict, or a leader who prepared for the worst and confronted threats head-on? A ruler who sought to be loved by all, or one who understood that being feared by your enemies is the only way to protect your people? History remembers King Viserys as a good man, but it also remembers the legacy of his passivity, the bloodiest civil war the realm had ever seen, dragons killing dragons, cities reduced to ash, and the permanent decline of Targaryen power. Daemon Targaryen was not a perfect man, nor would he have been a gentle king, but he understood the nature of power, he inspired genuine loyalty, he led his men from the front lines, and he defended his house with relentless intensity. He accepted that wearing the crown required a willingness to make impossible, bloody choices. He was not a perfect ruler for an idealized kingdom. He was the necessary ruler for the harsh reality of Westeros, and that is why he deserved the Iron Throne. But there is one thing that I don't think is up for debate. Whether you love Daemon or hate him, no one can deny that he commanded respect. Not because of his title, and not because of his last name, but because of who he was. When Daemon entered a room, everyone noticed. When Daemon spoke, people listened. When Daemon flew into battle on Caraxes, entire armies changed their plans. You simply couldn't ignore him. That's something Viserys never truly had. Viserys wore the crown. Daemon carried the presence of a king. And sometimes, those are two very different things. Think about every great ruler in Westerosi history. Aegon the Conqueror, Jaehaerys the Conciliator, or even Tywin Lannister, though he was never king. What did they all have in common? People believed they were in control, not because they always were, but because they projected certainty, confidence, and authority. Daemon had that in abundance. He rarely doubted himself, for better and sometimes for much worse. But in a feudal society like Westeros, perception is often as important as reality. A king who appears weak invites challengers. A king who appears unshakable often prevents those challenges from ever happening. That's why I believe Daemon would have had one enormous advantage over Viserys. He would have made people think twice. And sometimes thinking twice is enough to stop a war before it begins. Now, does that erase his flaws? Absolutely not. You could make an entire video arguing why Daemon would have been a terrible king, and honestly, it would probably be a very good video. That's the beauty of George R.R. Martin's writing. His best characters aren't heroes, and they aren't villains. They're human. They force us to weigh impossible choices. Would you rather have a kind king whose indecision destroys the realm, or a ruthless king whose strength keeps the peace? There isn't an easy answer. And that's exactly why we're still talking about Daemon years after House of the Dragon introduced him to millions of viewers. So now I want to hear from you. If Viserys had named Daemon his heir from the very beginning, would the Dance of the Dragons have been prevented? Would House Targaryen still have ruled with dragons for generations? Or would King Daemon have become another Maegor, proving everyone right to fear him? Let me know what you think down in the comments, because when it comes to Daemon Targaryen, the debate might never truly end.